Politics, Day 7. This is going to be the last day of this unit, and we are going to be talking about what politics look like in the Jim Crow South. So one of the things I wanted you to start with, this isn't a grade, but I wanted you to look at the Louisiana literacy test. You have 10 minutes to complete this test. If you look at the rules on the top of it, this is how it would have been given in the Jim Crow South in Louisiana. But I want you to look at that and go through it. And just as you go through it, think about and answer the question, why would this test be made so difficult? And why were some of the questions vague? Think about those. Think about them realistically. And I think you'll be able to come up with the answers to those questions. So what was the South like after Reconstruction? You're going to see that a lot of areas in the South did remain segregated or were segregated after Reconstruction. Most of them were not segregated by law. That's called de facto segregation. De facto segregation is where people naturally segregate themselves. De jure segregation is where it is done by law. You will see Southern schools were segregated. Access to jobs, courts, social services were usually racially determined and very unequal. And in 1887, you would have the railroads to become the first public accommodation to be legally segregated. So that's de jure segregation. African Americans would be heavily involved in politics, but usually power remained in the hands of whites. And gerrymandering and voter intimidation were used to silence black voters. You'll see this political cartoon right here. If you look at that, this cartoon is always created or always was made to represent what gerrymandering was. And basically, what gerrymandering is creating your congressional districts, your voting districts in a way to basically you're going to weave them around and basically make them in such a way that they can reduce the voting powers of certain groups of people. So here's some examples. The top one here, this is Virginia's current congressional districts. And if you look especially around cities, how the congressional districts are drawn around cities. If you look at Lynchburg there, Lynchburg is actually split between, Lynchburg and Bedford County is split between two districts. Now, this Virginia map doesn't have a ton of gerrymandering type things, but if you look at this old North Carolina map at the bottom there, if you look at the fifth congressional district there, look at how it runs through North Carolina. It hits Charlotte, Salisbury, High Point, and that kind of thing. And the reason that districts are drawn that way is if you think about it, so typically African Americans tend to vote Democratic. So what you want to do is to be able to, or what they're trying to do with gerrymandering is reduce the power of that voting block. So what you do is you draw districts in such a way that they hit the cities where you have a large concentration of African Americans. You get a little bit, maybe half of them, and then you spread the district out into rural areas where you have more conservative voters. And that way you reduce the power of that one small group of voters. Now, gerrymandering, there's been a lot of movements towards getting rid of this. The Supreme Court has stepped in and done some things. And actually, Virginia in 2020 has on the ballot an amendment to create a bipartisan group to draw voting districts so that you can hopefully avoid these gerrymandering and that kind of thing that happen. But this was a way of reducing the power of African American voters during this time. So Southern politics, again, the South would be strongly Democratic after Reconstruction, and they were known as the Redeemers for redeeming the South from Republican domination. Democrats often favor the policies of separating blacks and whites as a means of treating African Americans as socially inferior. And by appealing to race, the Redeemers used it as a rallying cry to deflect attention away from concerns of poor farmers and other areas, instead focused on race, basically as a way of exciting and motivating voters to get out and vote. And that's why you're going to see in like political cartoons and that kind of thing, there's going to be a lot of degradation of African Americans in them, or a lot of like trying to scare people into voting for the Democratic Party by, propagating this whole like race type thing within the election. So the South would become known as the Solid South because of Democrats dominating the South in a big way. The Southern Democrats would often denounce populists for promoting what they called Negro rule during this time. Again, that's going to be another common trend that you're going to see in campaign material and political cartoons. Populists had pushed for poor whites and blacks to work together for a political party. Democrats still pushed for black voters and used fraud to win some elections. Again, the whole idea that dead people vote in trying to get votes however they could. If you see this map right here, this actually shows the percentages per state of Democratic voters during this time period that we're talking about. And if you look at the Deep South there, 90% of voters being in the Democratic Party. And again, this is why it was called the Solid South, because you could solidly count on it to vote for the Democratic Party. The black treatment in the South, of course, often African Americans face discrimination and segregation through Jim Crow laws, intimidation through like the KKK, and lynching as well. Lynching was very, very common in areas in the South. This picture right here is from the lynching of Ruby Stacey in 1935. He was hung after a white woman had filed a complaint against him in Florida. He had been a homeless tenant farmer that had gone to the house to ask for food, and people didn't like that, so he was being taken to jail, actually, when people overcome the people that were taking him to jail and lynched him. And you're going to see that a lot of times this is what African Americans would face in the South, and there was a lot of fear in the South of what could happen if you offended a white person, what might happen that you could be lynched just for that type of thing. So unfortunately, that was very, very common, and it's very sad that that was common that happened. So black disenfranchisement, in 1890, you'd have Mississippi, which would adopt a literacy test to drive blacks out of politics. It was dressed up as a reform for those tired of electoral fraud and violence. And it said, hey, a literacy test is the way to make sure that there's no voter fraud or anything like that. They did put grandfather clauses into these, which allowed a man to vote only if his grandfather had cast ballots in the elections prior to Reconstruction. So again, you had a lot of poor whites that might not have been able to pass some of these literacy tests. So basically, they rigged the system in such a way that whites would be able to vote and blacks would not be able to vote. And you're going to see that once the Populist Party dies, as far as your poor farmers and stuff that were the ones that were very interested in the Populist Party. Once that dies off, you're going to see a lot of bitter whites turn their fury towards blacks. And Southern politicians knew this. And again, they tried to appeal to these racial prejudice of people in order to get them to vote for the Democratic Party. Now, civil rights cases of 1883, you're going to see the Supreme Court would get involved in this, probably not in the way that African Americans would want them to. The Supreme Court would rule that Congress could not legislate against racial discrimination practiced by private citizens, which included railroads, hotels, and other businesses used by the public. So basically, the 14th Amendment applied to states, which 14th Amendment gives equal protection under the law to African Americans, but not to individuals. The Supreme Court would emphasize in this case that the time had come where former slaves were to be considered normal citizens rather than a special group favored by the law. So the Supreme Court was moving away from a lot of these Reconstruction laws and all these things that have been put in place to protect the civil rights of African Americans. The Supreme Court was moving away from that. And finally, that brings us to the big case of the era, which would be the Plessy versus Ferguson case. This is known as the separate but equal case. So Jim Crow laws, of course, had been created to segregate public locations such as railroads, restaurants, libraries, anything that you can think of. Finally, this case was brought to the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, and the court would rule that state laws on segregation were not discriminatory and did not violate the 14th Amendment. And what they said in their ruling was that things could be separate as long as they were equal. So this doctrine was born. Now, in reality, do you really think that segregated facilities were actually equal? No, most people knew that they were not equal. In pretty much every way they were unequal, but this is how the Supreme Court would justify and say that these laws were okay in the South. They had to follow the separate but equal doctrine. Again, going back to the 14th Amendment, ensuring equal protection under the law. This is one of those Civil War amendments. Homer Plessy, actually sharing a little bit of information on this case here. It's very interesting when you look at this case because Homer Plessy was 1/8 African American, and Louisiana law at the time classified that anyone 1/8 African American was black under the law. This is a picture right here of Homer Plessy. Plessy, though, had been chosen by the Citizens Committee of New Orleans to violate this law on this train car during this time, to violate the law with the hopes that the Supreme Court would overturn segregation laws. And you're going to see that this happens a lot of times with these cases that you have come, and with things such as later down the road when we talk about Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks actually was very much involved with the NAACP, and her doing what she did on the bus was done on purpose to try to push a case before the Supreme Court. And that's what would happen in Homer Plessy's case, because, and they actually, the Citizens Committee of New Orleans are the ones that made sure that he got arrested. They contacted the law to make sure that he would be arrested for being on this train car. Because if you looked at him, he just looked like he was white, and nobody would have known that he was actually 1/8 African American. So again, Plessy versus Ferguson determines the separate but equal. I love this political cartoon that says separate but not equal, showing the difference there in treatment. So by saying that, both sides are being treated equally, most people knew that that wasn't really the case. So during this time, again, Plessy versus Ferguson is going to open things up and make them even worse for African Americans. In 1896, you'd have 130,000 black voters. By 1904, that number was down to 1,300. That is absolutely astonishing that you're going to lose that many voters in that short amount of time. And that means these voters are just being taken off of the voter rolls. 1898, the court would uphold the use of literacy tests to determine qualifications for voting. African Americans will often be prohibited from serving on juries. They would be given harsher punishments and penalties for crimes, and kept out of skilled trades and factory jobs. You would also see a spike in lynching during this time as well. If you look here, we are in the time period here where it says Jim Crow laws passed. Remember, we talked about the KKK was first founded as a tool of the Democratic Party to get votes for the Democratic Party. The KKK would die off in most areas in the country after the South returned to democratic rule. But then you're going to have a spike during this time, and eventually the second KKK is going to be founded. But you can see the spike there with Jim Crow laws leads to an increase in lynching. This song right here was written by Billie Holiday. It's called Strange Fruit. She sings it. I don't think she wrote it. If you just read the lyrics there, you can listen to the song talking about what strange fruit is. It's pretty easy to figure that out once you read the lyrics there. This video right here, you can watch at your own discretion. It's a very short video about the lynching of Jesse Washington. This is something that the BBC did on race in America. I will warn you, this video is very, very violent and graphic, includes pictures of lynchings and the use of offensive terms. Again, they're talking about them in a historic sense to show what had happened. Without watching the video, you can read there what exactly happened. But basically, the case of the lynching of Jesse Washington is one of those where it shows, again, it didn't matter if you were black and if you were innocent or not innocent. You were probably going to be found guilty and be punished by lynching for the crime that you had committed. So again, things were not very good for African Americans in the South. And I encourage you to watch that video. Don't feel like that you have to, because it does describe in pretty violent detail what happened to Jesse Washington, which was terrible. Even if he did happen to be guilty, we have rules in this country, laws against cruel and unusual punishment, and what he went through was definitely cruel and unusual. So on the back of all this, what were reformers trying to do this time, especially African American reformers? Ida B. Wells, she was a female African American. You see her pictured there. She was actually thrown from a train in Tennessee for refusing to give her seat up in a section reserved by whites. In response to this, she would set out to educate the country about the horrors of lynching in the South and led an anti-lynching campaign. She would actually write a book about lynching laws and how they were used basically to put African Americans back into a form of slavery. So she would be one, again, that would really bring attention to those lynching laws. Bishop Henry Turner, he got very, very angry about Jim Crow laws, and he formed the International Migration Society in 1894 with the goal to help blacks immigrate to Africa. Only about 500 African Americans would actually make this journey to Liberia. But again, you're going to see that African Americans are going to be very torn on how to go about exact reform. And you actually see this idea come up several times. We talked about this idea even before the Civil War in white reformers talking about this idea. And now you're going to have some black reformers that come up with the same idea as well and say, hey, the only way that African Americans will get a free shot is if they go back to Africa. Booker T. Washington, he was born in Franklin County, right to our south. He was born into slavery, would get his freedom with the end of the Civil War. His family would end up moving to West Virginia, and he would get an education, would become probably one of the most educated African Americans during his day. In 1881, he would establish an industrial and agricultural school for African Americans in Tuskegee, Alabama, which would be Tuskegee Institute, which is today Tuskegee University. And Washington's big focus was he believed that education and earning money would empower African Americans more effectively than a ballot. So he believed that the way for African Americans really to get respect within the United States was to work hard, achieve economically, and then that would lead people to further respect them. You'll see that's why he founded a school to teach them skills. And then in 1900, he would organize the National Negro Business League in order to help support African American businesses. Now, you are going to see, we're going to talk about there is disagreement within the Black community, whether what he was doing was the right thing, but this was what he felt like was the best way for reform. In 1895, he would engage what was known as the Atlanta Compromise. He would give a speech in Atlanta, Georgia, known as the Accommodationist speech. He would retreat from the older defiant stand of Black abolitionists by having a conciliatory attitude before white audiences. He would say the agitation of questions of social equality is extremist folly. So again, he believed in accommodating and trying to work within the system that we had to change the system in meaningful ways. And he saw and said, look, the political way of doing things isn't working. So let's try this way of, again, going through Black economic progress. And hopefully that will open the eyes of whites to see the justice needed of Black rights. Again, a lot of people didn't agree with this because they felt like he was saying that he was somehow condoning and saying like that what was happening in the South was segregation and everything was happening. He was not saying that with that, and he would have fully disagreed with that idea. And he, of course, did not support segregation. But he felt the best way to bring change was to work within that system to bring change. Now, one of the people, again, that is going to very much disagree with Booker T. Washington would be W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois believed that Washington was not doing enough. He said things are getting worse for Blacks, even in the North. And he's criticized Booker T. Washington and said that Booker T. Washington was too willing to accept segregation. So William Monroe Trotter and Du Bois would start the Niagara movement. And this would encourage Black pride and an uncompromising demand for full political and civil equality. So Du Bois basically looked at this and said, look, we are not accepting segregation. We're not accepting being treated as second-class citizens. Yeah, it's good if Blacks go and learn skills and try to achieve economic equality, but economic equality means nothing without political equality. And that's what he believed. He said segregation needs to end and we need civil rights for all Americans, not just white Americans during this time. So again, he disagreed with the way that Booker T. Washington was going to go about bringing change. Also, Du Bois would go on to help found the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. I'm sure you've heard of it. It is still around today advocating for civil rights for not just Blacks, but all kinds of groups as well. He would meet with Mary White Ovington, and they would create the NAACP. Du Bois would be the editor of The Crisis, which would be the journal of the NAACP. And again, they would use this platform to demand equal rights. The National Urban League would also be a very important part of this, would take the lead on social welfare policies to help Black migrants in the North. So you're going to see, again, they are pushing more of the political side of things to, hey, let's put pressure on the government for change, whereas Booker T. Washington said, hey, let's work within what we can do and try to become economically equal to whites. You'd also have during this time black farmers working together to create the Colored Farmers Alliance. And again, this was meant to give them a political voice with white populists during that time. And again, as it was during that time, you had to be very, very careful as an African American about what you said and what you did, because being too outspoken could be dangerous for you and your family, and it could end up getting you lynched. So again, even with these strides, there is still going to be a lot of fear during this time. And that is going to be one of the things that is going to lead African Americans to leave the South and move into the North. During the 20th century, this is known as the Great Migration, where African Americans start leaving the South in big numbers to move to the North. Now, social discrimination, of course, was definitely one of the reasons they left, but a lot of African Americans were in poverty in the South, and they saw a big opportunity to move into the North to find jobs. Again, we talked about all the immigrants coming into the country to work in the factories in the North, and African Americans were doing the same thing. You can see there a map of the Great Migration during this time in the cities in which African Americans were moving to in big numbers during this time, and they're all going to be these industrial cities where there was a lot of jobs. So, were things better in the North? You could say yes. In some respects, they were better. But overall, you're going to see African Americans in the North are still going to be faced with a lot of discrimination. Many African Americans would find, while you might not be threatened with lynching in the North, there were still a lot of social attitudes a lot of people didn't like African Americans. The North, you're going to see generally would use more subtle ways to enforce segregation of the races. And again, sometimes not so subtle. This sign right here, you can see this was placed in a neighborhood in Detroit, Michigan, saying we want white tenants in our white community. Again, that's Detroit, Michigan. That political cartoon down there is actually in reference to Chicago in slimming areas there that were actually split between whites and blacks there. So while, yes, in some ways things were better in the North, there was less of a chance of lynching and that kind of thing. Again, attitudes towards African Americans still were not great. And African Americans still had to deal with a lot of racism and discrimination in the North as well. So the last thing I'm going to have you do here is look at some Jim Crow laws. And I think when you think about Jim Crow laws, we don't really realize the extent to which they go to. And every year when I have students read these Jim Crow laws, they're always astonished at how silly some of them actually are. Like to think how silly is it to think that a white and a black person can't share a library book? How ridiculous is that? So I encourage you, read these and answer these questions. And again, as you can see, at this point in history, our country has made a lot of progress in a lot of ways. Race relations, though, is one of those areas that we're going to see continue battle. And it's like, 2 steps forward, 1 step back as far as race relations would go in this country during this time, especially in the Jim Crow South. So I hope you all have a great day. Again, this is this last day of Unit 6. And after you do this, go ahead and do your test review as well. I hope all of you have a fantastic day.